what I'm going to do is, first of all, talk about the kind of rationale why I want to take this particular view on the topic rather than just talking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine itself. And then I want to talk about some of the kind of the concepts that are useful for understanding it. Now, I know that sounds like a bit of a academic consideration, and luckily we are all academics, so hopefully I don't have to justify that too hard, but particularly because I think there's practical reasons why what we talk about in relation to information and warfare actually has some kind of implications on how that plays out. So, so I'm going to share some slides to kind of help work through those concepts as well. So if you just will bear with me one moment. Okay, hopefully you can all see this. Shout up if not, please. So as I say, I'll justify kind of why I'm taking this approach. Then I'm going to do some disambiguation of the sort of concepts that we want to talk about. I'll then go through some of the informational successes and failures on both sides of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and then talk more broadly about the kind of wider implications, the lessons that we can draw about the relationship between public opinion, information, and war. So first of all, my kind of rationale for why I'm doing this essentially, and why war can't really be understood without understanding information, you know, in general, but specifically this war, I think, is a key example of that. And you know, obviously, this is a very significant war that's going on European territory, not the only European war that's happened in recent years, but you know, a full-scale overland invasion, which has, you know, very unfortunate historical parallels. Which I think make the significance of the war itself very important. You know, this we know. But the reason I want to focus on the information side of the war is for three reasons. The first of these is that Russia has a very clear form for using information operations. And I think there's quite widespread general awareness that Russia does this, even if it's not always clear exactly what and how it's doing it. But there is, I guess, a kind of ambiguity around what Russia does and when. And I think if there is that sort of ambiguity, it can be more difficult to deal with things effectively. And so that's why I want to bring in the disambiguation of the processes. And then the third reason I want to focus on the information side of this warfare is because for Russia, very clearly, information operations are tightly wound up in their broader foreign policy and military strategy. So from the Russian side, you know, nothing happens in this war without an eye to the way that that plays both domestically and internationally. So we can't understand how the war is actually playing out properly unless we can understand those informational considerations. So that's why I'm taking this quite specific approach. So the disambiguation that I wanted to go over, there are various terms that we relate to Russia's information operations, or, you know, information warfare or propaganda. You know, we've heard lots of terms about it. I'm sure you're pretty well aware of lots of them. But the terms I wanted to talk about today were the differences between disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation, first of all. So disinformation is false information, and it's intentionally spread in order to gain some sort of strategic advantage. Misinformation is false information that is not intentionally spread. So a classic example of this would be when, you know, a satirical article is unknowingly shared as a real article by somebody online. So they believe that it's truthful, but it's not, but it was never intended, you know, it wasn't produced to deceive. The final category is the opposite of this. So this is malinformation, where genuinely true but damaging information is released on purpose to gain strategic advantage. And the kind of classic example of this that Russia's foreign intelligence services are often engaged in is hacking and leaking. So if you look back to the last presidential election, or the last but one presidential elections in the US, we had hacking of the Democratic National Committee and quite unflattering information put into the global media environment that was deliberately done in order to disrupt that process. And then the final kind of category I want to talk about is propaganda. And this is a difficult concept, I think, to mobilize for a number of reasons. So, in general terms, propaganda relates to when representations are being manipulated deliberately to influence human action. And that much is, fairly simple to understand. But initially, when this term was first mobilized at the beginning of the 20th century, it was basically seen as a kind of it was advertising speak basically, and the potential to influence human behavior, not necessarily negatively, so potentially to engage in more healthy behavior, for example, or to gain commercial advantage. So even when there were people kind of debating whether or not PR type operations could be used for social good, there was always kind of questions about the extent to which this was, a morally defensible practice. And that kind of debate has gone on over time. So there are a lot of normative debates about propaganda, whether it's good or bad, whether it's justifiable or not, whether it's contingent on circumstances or not. And that can make it a little bit difficult to apply analytically, not least because certainly in the contemporary context, when you refer to something as propaganda, there tends to be the assumption that that is a moral judgment as well, rather than a mere descriptor that this is representations being manipulated in certain ways to influence human action. There's the assumption that that's for a negative purpose or is not morally justifiable. But this being the case, I think it's quite important to point out that it happens in both democratic and authoritarian contexts. It's not the preserve of authoritarian regimes. And especially when we think about the conduct of war and conflict, the use of propaganda in war is as old as war is. That kind of the binding up the way that a war is represented with the conduct of the war is often very important for strategic reasons, because it's to do with building your coalition, clearly defining the us versus the them, all those things that we know to be important when trying to mobilize people and trying to set out in and out groups. So the reason I'm introducing these concepts now basically is because during the conduct of war, all of these can come into play, not necessarily at the same time, but sometimes at the same time. And the way in which you deal with each of these different types of disordered information would differ depending on the kind of process taking place. So it's important to be able to kind of recognize them to work out how you can kind of how you can combat them, I suppose. And some of the techniques that I think are quite useful in doing this, I'm going to introduce two of them, and again, these will probably be quite familiar to many of you, I'm sure. The first is framing. And framing is essentially the way that information is selected or highlighted, or conversely excluded or de-emphasized, in order to create a particular type of representation. And usually this goes through four kind of stages. So the first of these would be to define the problem, the second would be to identify the cause, the third would be to impose a moral evaluation on that, and then kind of leading naturally from that would be the proposed solution. And as I mentioned before, propaganda can, refer to processes in both democratic and authoritarian states. So the example of the framing of a problem I've given here is that of 9/11. So the 9/11 attacks were framed very much in terms of global terrorism, and global terrorism being a threat. The cause identified for this was Islamist extremists, who were evaluated on a moral basis as being both evil and threatening, so an existential threat as well. And the proposed solution was the global war on terror. So you can see a kind of clear policy related implication of the way in which events are framed. But frames themselves, I don't think, are standalone. And to understand why states use specific frames, or what kind of policy advantages they seek to accrue from this, it's quite useful to think in terms of strategic narratives. And this, I think, is a concept with quite rapidly expanding academic attention, certainly in the past kind of 10, 15 years or so. And the concept of strategic narratives refers to well, basically, it's used as a tool for political actors to extend their influence, manage expectations, and change the discursive environment in which they operate. But basically, the idea is that by creating an impression globally of the way things were, the way things are, and the way things will be, you can create the conditions that are favourable to your state achieving its strategic ends. So it basically involves a very particular kind of articulation of the past, of the present, and of the future, such that a state can attempt to achieve its objectives within that narrative of how things were, are, and will be. And in warfare, I think strategic narratives are quite important because wars are emotive things. So it's not enough to know what the specific facts are, what has empirically happened, but the way in which you perceive those as being part of a broader story, or broader kind of articulation of morality, of defensibility. These emotional questions are extremely important. So in warfare, for sides to kind of create more openness to their own strategic desires, I think strategic narratives are incredibly important. And it's this idea of getting emotional buy-in or having emotional resonance of your particular story of that conflict. And in general, these strategic narratives will have some sort of characterization of all of the key aspects of the conflict, including the actors involved, the actions that they undertake, their exertion of agency or lack thereof, the purpose of any strategic actions undertaken, but also the broader kind of scenery and setting in which the conflict takes place, including the kind of historical and geopolitical context that leads up to it. So often actors will work very hard to create a particular impression of what the geopolitical historical context of a conflict is, because that can be used or attempted to be used to justify particular actions. And again, this is extremely relevant. We think about how the Russian political elite has gone about attempting to justify its invasion of Ukraine. And I'll come on to that in more detail presently. So if we think about, in general, some of the ways in which this war has been represented, I want to start with the Russian side, and that is not because I want to privilege the Russian account, but for a very practical reason, that Russia was the military aggressor in this particular conflict. And so the Russian side did the kind of attempted heavy lifting early on of setting the narratives that would allow it to conduct this invasion, successfully or not, and we'll return to that. But that's why I'm starting with the Russian side. Now, this invasion did not just start this year. It's a culmination of longer lasting processes. Certainly, you can date it back at least to 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea. You could potentially maybe date it back to 2008 in the Russo-Georgian War, when many of the tactics we've seen now in terms of legitimation and justification were almost piloted, I guess, in relation to the Georgian conflict. I will return to that in a moment, but I'm going to start specifically at 2014 to kind of date this. And we saw basically Russia's annexation of Crimea, supposedly because it was defending the interests of Russian speakers in Crimea. Later, a referendum was held about whether Crimea would want to reunify with Russia, and that's the word that was used officially, and also the framing that was imposed that this was a reunification that would go back to the kind of historical precedent of Crimea belonging to Russia. And at the same time, we saw the provocation of conflict in the Donbass regions of eastern Ukraine. And the idea behind that was supposedly that the self-declared people's republics in Donetsk and Luhansk wanted independence from Ukraine. Not even that they wanted to join Russia, but they specifically wanted independence. These were Russian-speaking regions, and the argument was that Russian speakers were being mistreated there, that there weren't enough legal protections for the status of Russian as a national language. And Russia supplied arms to the so-called separatists, who in fact have very many clear links to the Russian military as well. They're not purely separatists. But this was the kind of justification that was used, and one that we have seen a return to in this broader invasion. So we then go back to kind of late 2021, early 2022, when there were very clear buildups of troops on the borders of Ukraine, and Western intelligence suggested that an invasion was imminent, which Russia issued blanket denials of repeatedly, and went about kind of portraying these as being Russophobic, hysterical reactions from a West that always wanted to point the blame at Russia, regardless of what the reality was. Now, this kind of worked actually until it didn't. And what I mean by that is that although Western intelligence agencies knew about the troop buildups and warned of an invasion, until that invasion actually took place, there was still a lot of questioning about, surely this can't happen, surely there's no strategic rationale for it. And in many ways, those kind of clear blanket denials from Russia, I think, appeared to have truth to them, because people couldn't quite see why there was any strategic rationale for an invasion, and it didn't marry up to the reality of the troop deployments. Now, when Russia did invade, it looked as if it had been obvious all along that that is what was going to happen, despite the fact that up until the moment of invasion, people were questioning whether it was kind of possible or plausible. And I want to return back to the Georgian example here, because this is one of the ways in which the informational component of warfare is extremely significant. Now, up to this day, when you ask many people what had happened in Georgia, the kind of, or what triggered conflict in Georgia, the interpretation is that there was Russian troop buildup, and the Georgians kind of lost their nerve and provoked the Russians into attacking. And this actually is very much a Kremlin bottom line. And that is precisely the kind of framing that the Russian side wanted to use for this invasion. So the idea was that you would kind of provoke the Ukrainians into doing something incautious, and then kind of respond to that with an invasion that wasn't pre-planned but was just a response. Now, because of the fact that Western intelligence agencies published in advance their intelligence about troop movements, this was completely implausible. And so it was not possible for Russia to use that initial strategic narrative that worked so well in Georgia, because the intelligence that would normally be kept secret was made very publicly available. So to that extent, the kind of battle for that first moment, the setting of the initial narrative of the conflict amongst broader international publics and policymaking audiences, that was blown away. And that's very important when we think about the way in which international support, certainly amongst Western and Euro-Atlantic countries, has been forthcoming. A lot of that is to do with that very, very clear move at the beginning to deny Russia the narrative primacy over the cause of its invasion. The next thing I want to move on to is the narratives around the kind of manufacturing consent, or the basically like the court of public and policy making opinion around it, which kind of leads on from what I was just talking about. And in this, we saw very different tactics from Russia and Ukraine, and we continue to see very different tactics between Russia and Ukraine. So in the Russian context, for the domestically focused informational operations, initially, as I'm sure everybody knows, and to this day, in fact, despite it not having any sort of semblance of reality, this was not portrayed as an invasion or even a war, but a special military operation. And the idea behind that is, if something is small and delimited, has clear strategic objectives, it's much more palatable than a large-scale war, and especially a large-scale war with something that has been referred to as a brotherly nation for a very long time, and a nation with which most Russian families have at least some family or friends links across the border. Now, as the special military operation logic began to quite clearly unravel, we saw a really dramatic change in the information environment in Russia, where any sort of opposition or dissent was comprehensively squeezed out. Now, this is not a brand new occurrence this year. So for the past 6 or 7 years, we've seen a creeping restriction of the Russian media space through increased legislation around blogging, for example, because that was quite an oppositional informational space, more onerous legal obligations of NGOs who might say critical things, greater powers given to the Russian media regulator. And these, did work to sort of slightly restrict the media space, but it wasn't comprehensive censorship. And really what the Kremlin relied upon was essentially flooding domestic airwaves with pro-Kremlin perspectives, which it did fairly comprehensively through state TV, which is very widely watched. And it could afford to let some oppositional accounts come through in things like newspapers, which don't have a very high circulation, because these were kind of drowned out by the pro-Kremlin channels. Now, since this invasion, we've seen that position completely change. So there is basically no oppositional media space available now. And that means that oppositional news outlets, both kind of web outlets and print outlets, have been shut down. A very famous oppositional radio station, Echo Moskvy, has now been shut down. And just to put this into context, this operated through the Soviet period. Even then, this kind of dissenting radio voice was allowed. It was shut down at the start of invasion after the presenters on the program openly talked about whether or not Putin should be tried for war crimes. So that's completely gone now. And then the other side of this is the kind of manufacturing of big shows of public support and the attempt to cleave to particular symbols that justify what's going on. So we've seen the adoption of this Z symbol, which has appeared on tanks. So this Z does not appear in the Russian alphabet. It was kind of a designation for the particular military jurisdictions that the different tanks were linked to, but it's become a general symbol of the invasion, has been mobilized in many ways. So you can see on this screen I've got up at the moment, the yellow banner, it reads Za Putina with a Z, a Latin alphabet Z, in the St. George's ribbon colours, which is, a very important veteran symbol in Russia. So Za Putina means for Putin. So this whole war has kind of been turned into a pro-Putin type symbol, I guess. And below that, you see a picture of Babushka Z, who is a Ukrainian old lady who greeted Ukrainian troops with a Soviet flag, mistakenly thinking they were Russian troops. And it's one of those very few examples of a kind of positive reception for Russian troops. And so, because this seems like a nice, cozy, warm symbol, it's been done to death. It's appeared on the side of buildings, monuments. So she's seen as being kind of symbolic of these liberated people of Ukraine who have Russia to thank for their liberation from the Ukrainian so-called neo-Nazi forces. At the same time, we've seen Russian state domestic TV becoming increasingly bellicose, and the initial call for denazification of Ukraine, which obviously is nonsense anyway, but that's how it was framed. That's actually almost comprehensively been switched to calls for de-Ukrainization. And the logic we're seeing in a lot of Russian state media is that Ukraine's a completely manufactured entity. So to even believe in the idea of Ukrainian national identity, you have to be an ultra-nationalist. So it's pretty much genocidal rhetoric, actually, and devoid of any sort of real logic, but very much based on a highly contingent view of Russian and Ukrainian history. And we've seen in occupied territories in Ukraine various kind of pro-Russian posters and placards being put up. The one I've shown on the screen there is kind of got this video game aesthetic, I suppose, and this progress bar is labelled denazification 99.9%. And the idea that we're seeing increasingly in Russian media is that it's not just the leadership of Ukraine that's compromised, but rather the whole population has kind of been complicit in the Nazification of Ukraine, and it will take generations to row back on that. Now, internationally, Russia's made very cynical attempts to muddy the waters, one of the most horrible of which was when the crimes in Bucha became apparent. So, kind of mass executions in Bucha. Russia attempted to table at the UN Security Council a discussion of Ukrainian genocide in Bucha, as in a genocide committed by Ukraine. And the UK, which was chairing at the time, refused to convene for that, specifically because in the past we have seen Russia use international fora like that to basically to broaden the appeal of its disinformation narratives, by, you give a sort of legitimacy to an allegation by debating it as if it had any sort of merit. We've seen attempts, I think, to portray Putin as a man of the people. So there's an example here of him meeting wounded veterans, although there are many conspiracy theories abounding in the Russian-speaking media space about the familiarity of these figures who look very similar to some of Putin's core security detail, but dressed up in hospital regalia. And then the multiple memes we saw circulating about Putin's ridiculously long table at which he hosted various international figures and also members of his own military and security services. He also saw at a very long table, so a very kind of distant figure. I think an attempt to look authoritative, but in a way, which I'll talk about in a moment, has kind of backfired quite a lot. Now, aside from this, Russia has attempted to court the global countries of the global south with a more kind of counter-hegemonic narrative. So the idea that the ultimate explanation for this conflict is NATO expansion, which put Russia in a completely impossible position, that Ukraine brought it on itself by getting too close to the EU or too close to NATO, maybe that it's the EU's fault for letting Ukraine entertain these ambitions, that Ukraine's irresponsible to just not concede and actually all further bloodshed is on Ukraine's hands. Essentially, it's anybody's fault but Russia's. So according to Russia's strategic narrative, Ukraine is run by a neo-Nazi leadership. Its people are complicit in Nazism. Russians are the liberators, liberating an oppressed people. And the scene of this is primarily Donbass and the separatist regions, but that the kind of heart of the neo-Nazi monster is in Kiev, and that's why there needs to be a sort of broader application of this special military operation. If we move on to the Ukrainian perspective, there's been a very different sort of messaging. So for Ukraine, it was very important to articulate early on that we are all in this together. And that's, I think, a very standard feature of when you have asymmetric warfare, a very large military against a smaller, more targeted force. It's important that you can garner volunteers, that you can gain public support, that everyone essentially can play their part. And one of the big boosts to this was Zelensky's own presence on the front line, not least because I think Russia miscalculated strategically. This is a kind of billionaire media personality who became a president. Certainly, as soon as he was first elected in Ukraine, there were scathing discussions of him on Russian on Russian mainstream media as being, just a celebrity, a kind of pampered celebrity, essentially. So the idea that he would stay behind was quite a shock, I think, but also was extremely effective for the Ukrainian side in helping to garner public support, and gives a very kind of clear illustration of the idea that the elites and the general public are working together. And you can see here in the bottom right of the screen, there's one of the selfie videos that Zelensky gave from Kiev with members of his with other ministers, showing that they are right there on the front lines. And this is an example, I think, of very clear, direct and open communication from the political leadership to the public, but not done as a sort of hierarchical thing, done as a peer-to-peer format, selfie videos. And you see, again, when Zelensky visited wounded Ukrainian soldiers, he was very social with them, he took selfies with them. It very much created the idea that there was a sort of horizontal relationship between those involved. And this rests to a large extent on his genuine popularity in the Ukrainian population, because if we look at previous Ukrainian elections, you could see a split between the East and the West voting for, respectively, Russian-speaking / pro-Russian and Ukrainian-speaking more supposedly more independently Ukrainian politicians. In the case of Zelensky, that was completely different. So every single region in Ukraine, apart from one, I think, voted for Zelensky in the last presidential elections by a very large margin. It was a landslide. So he's genuinely popular across the board. And this has very much helped, I think, in his general communication strategies. The other thing as well, in terms of building on the historical representations, is that for Ukraine, this is very much about survival, both survival of the people and survival as a standalone country. And it's being portrayed very much as an anti-colonial fight. And again, this has very clear historical precedent, because in Soviet times, there was a feeling that Ukraine was essentially being treated as a colony, as a Soviet colony. And we look back to things like the Holodomor in Ukraine, so the kind of forced starvation of the Ukrainian people due to grain requisitioning. These are very clear historical narratives that I think can be mapped onto the current conflict in a way that garners public support. Internationally, the idea that we're all in it together again has been played, but specifically by portraying Ukraine as the front line of Europe. So Ukraine's international communication is very much played up pro-liberal, pro-European type visuals. So we can see in a lot of the social media posts from official Ukrainian sources, there's a clear focus on women in the military, again, a kind of symbolic of European liberal ideals, I think. And in communication with overseas publics and policymakers, Zelensky's team's been very effective at tailoring those communications. So he's given addresses directly to the Belarusian public saying, we know that you don't support this and that matters to us. When he addressed the British Parliament, he used quotes from Shakespeare. He's invited international leaders to come to Kiev, have lovely photo opportunities, which kind of makes it worth their while, but also helps to create that kind of groundswell of support as well. So I think it's quite a savvy communicative strategy on the international level too. So to move on to the kind of last section, I want to talk about the sort of lessons that we can draw from these different approaches to media, public opinion, and war. Now, the first lesson is that narratives are much stronger than counter-narratives. Now, what I mean by that is that if you are able to set the narrative, then you're in a much stronger position than if you have to respond to a narrative. And the clear example of this is the difference between the Russo-Georgian War and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where it was not possible for Russia to create the impression that it was merely responding to an ill-advised provocation from the other side. So here, this early publication of intelligence data was extremely important in helping to set that narrative. And stories in general, I suppose, they're much more effective than brute facts in getting people on board. So having a clear kind of articulation of what's going on, who the various parties are and what their motivations are, is again extremely effective in getting people on side, whether that's domestically or internationally. And by the same token, if you don't have a compelling story, it can be much more difficult to garner support. Linked to this is the importance of symbols. So for Ukraine, the idea of Ukraine being both the underdog but also the front line of a Europe at threat has been extremely important, I think, for garnering support across Europe and of course North America as well. By contrast, in Russia, there's been this almost desperate attempt to cleave to the Z symbol, which is beginning to have extremely unfortunate parallels, although perhaps not necessarily inaccurate parallels. You can see here that there was a kind of viral video released where people are essentially saying, for Russia, for Putin, za Россия, za Putin, and with the Z. And it looks incredibly fascistic, both in aesthetic and general approach. And that's why I think there was this attempt to cleave to the babushka, the old lady Zeds, which again doesn't look particularly convincing, but there's a sort of desperate attempt to create some kind of resonant symbolism in Russia. And essentially what's happening is it's becoming just increasingly militarized, like glorification of the war for the war's sake, the reappropriation of St. George's ribbon, for example, because the kind of humanitarian side just looks incredibly implausible. The next point, the next lesson, I guess we can learn is that the relatability of messages and of narratives is extremely important. So on the Ukrainian side, Zelensky's appearance as one of us, rather than as being a millionaire who's divorced from us, has been extremely important for really relaying the message that Ukraine needs help, that Ukraine is kind of brave, is on the front line, is standing up for European independence. But it's also actually, we've seen a kind of almost a cosplaying of Zelensky. This has been seen as very important, very influential. There's been photos released of Macron in kind of much more casual gear than he would usually be seen in. Dmitry Medvedev, who was prior president of Russia and prime minister, he did the kind of castling move with Putin where they swapped roles. He's recently been photographed in kind of military type fatigues and just looks a little bit silly, to be honest. He looks like he's got a last minute costume for a costume party, but there's this attempt to kind of peg on to the sort of hyper masculine protector type image that Zelensky has managed to cultivate through this conflict. And the relatability is also underlined by the extent to which Ukrainians have portrayed themselves as Europeans at threat, just like the rest of Europe. And we can see that in the difference with which Ukrainian refugees have been treated. Poland has welcomed them with open arms, so has the UK, which is not typical of either country when it comes to refugees, certainly not from Syria or Afghanistan. But the flip side of this is the terrible treatment that we've seen afforded to Black Ukrainian refugees. And so this kind of relatability, it has its limits. And the legacy, I think, of particular narratives increases or decreases their relatability respectively. So for Poland and for the UK, the idea of Russia being a threat that we have to kind of show solidarity against, it's resonant because that echoes back to the idea of a Soviet threat, which, for both countries has a long history. It has a long sort of historic meaning. In terms of relatability for Russia, that's one of the reasons that they had to use the sort of special military operation language, because the idea of a large scale war with the neighboring country, the brother country of Ukraine, would have been very difficult to get any sort of public consent for, and the idea was that it would be over quickly and that would be fine. The fact that it's kind of dragged out means that there has been an attempt to change that rationale, so we're seeing increasingly explicit articulations of Russian imperialism now in the domestic arena, and the idea that that we're reverting to our historical gains. Ukraine's not even a real country; it's little Russia. And that this is just a reversion to what is historically natural if we reclaim our territory. And of course, if that had been the initial line, maybe it wouldn't have gone down so well, but it's been quite easy to creep up to that because there is a long, long legacy of Russian exceptionalism and narratives of kind of Russian imperial greatness, which these can peg onto. The fourth lesson is one about mixed strategies. So in all that we've seen, there are combinations of disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation, which on the whole, from both sides, you can think of as component parts of propaganda. And what's important, I think, at this stage is to remember that something being true doesn't necessarily mean that the goal is not manipulation. And something having historical precedent doesn't necessarily mean that the goal isn't manipulation. So you can think, for example, in terms of Russia's reference to neo-Nazis in Ukraine. The nuggets of truth to that are that some neo-Nazi based military battalions have been incorporated into Ukraine's wider military. It doesn't mean that the entirety of Ukraine is run by neo-Nazis, and that's the difference. So being able to separate out what are the facts from what is the broader truth, and whether or not the supposed broader truth being articulated does follow naturally from those facts or doesn't, that's one of the ways in which we can separate out misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation from propaganda. So, something being true doesn't necessarily mean that it represents the truth, and we have to be able to pick apart the specifics from the generals, I think. And this leads on to my final point, which is about truth and why it matters. So if we want to be able to look at the way in which wars are being communicated, it's not enough to think, is something specifically accurate information? but we also have to think about the representation of the wider whole and whether those representations reflect it or not. And to do that, we have to begin asking those very uncomfortable questions about, what are the interests behind this particular framing, and what are the strategic narratives that this framing serves, and which parties do these strategic narratives favour. Um, and so I think going forward, this is very important because we can already essentially see a waning interest in the conflict in Ukraine. It becomes newsworthy when particular horrific developments happen, but the fact that the conflict is ongoing has already become media background noise. So being able to kind of pick apart what's going on, and the fact that people are continuing to die, the fact that facts and narratives are being manipulated in order to sustain particular views on this conflict and to make certain actions seem justifiable. I think that's important when we think about the actual real life impact this is having for people on the ground. I'm going to end there, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you might have.